Okay. Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Catherine Goldberg. I'm a senior fellow with the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab at Johns Hopkins University. We have a really great set of speakers lined up today. Before we start, maybe I'll just give a couple housekeeping notes. The first is we're recording this presentation and we're going to upload it on our website so others can see. Second is we'll spend the first part of the webinar doing a presentation and then open it up for Q&A. So please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen throughout the presentation, and we will come back to those at the end for answering by our panelists. And then third point is that we are going to launch a newsletter very soon. We're really excited about it. And if you're interested, please sign up. Tim, if I could ask you to throw that sign up link in the chat box, that would be great. And with that, we will get started. I'm going to share my screen and do some intro to the lab work and to our panelists, and then I'll turn it over to our panelists. So let me make sure this works. Okay, hopefully you're seeing my screen. Yes.
Yeah.
Great. I can't see the Zoom screen anymore. So, all right. So here's just a bit about our lab. The Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab works at the intersection of clean energy supply chains and modern industrial policy. We think this is pretty unique because other organizations really work on either supply chains or industrial policy, but not both. And as a lab, our core mission is to provide the rigorous analytics that policymakers and companies need in order to do robust green industrial policy, both domestically and internationally. So how do you do this? Well, we all know the energy transition is geopolitical. To us, what that means is that you need to understand not only how supply chains work and how industrial policy is developed, but also the geopolitics surrounding both of those. And our lab works in 3 different work streams: the industrial base, the regional, and the global. On the industrial base team, we've developed a machine learning model that predicts countries' competitiveness across 10 different clean technologies. And this fall, we will be launching country profiles that identify the comparative advantages across these sectors, across these technologies, so that countries are better positioned to design green industrial policy. On the regional team, this team focuses on industrial policy development in specific countries. And so far, we've done deep dives into Mexico, Brazil, and India, where we've built really close relationships in government and also in civil society and industry. And then finally, the global work stream, which is where I sit in the lab. And this work entails engaging our G7 and G20 partners to help them use their limited public resources to develop strategic industrial policy, and also changing the rules and the frameworks that currently constrain industrial policy at the IMF and the World Bank. So here are a couple examples of our previous work, and you can see more at the URL linked at the bottom of the screen. I mentioned we did some in-depth analysis on Mexico, on Brazil. We also did some on Korea, Morocco, and the BRICS. And we also did some right after the US election on analyzing some of the policies that Trump put into place. So without further ado, let me introduce our 3 wonderful presenters and the brains behind the China report that you're all here to learn about. First, we have Matthias Larsen, who is a senior policy fellow at the London School of Economics Grantham Research Institute, where he leads the China work. Second, we have Xiaokang Shui, who goes by Harold. He's a researcher with us at the lab, and he focuses on emerging economies, particularly China. And then finally, we have Tim Sahai, who is the co-director of the lab. And I will turn it over to these three. Like I mentioned, we will do question and answers at the end of the meeting, so please put your questions in the chat as we go through. And over to Matthias, Harold, and Tim. Thanks.
Thanks, Catherine. I see the next slide here already. That's perfect. So as Catherine mentioned, my name is Matthias, and I work at the LSE, and I have played a role in developing this database and policy report together with Harold. So what I will talk about today is I will present this brand new data that I think really changes the way we should look at China's role in a global green transition. It is based on this policy brief that came out a week ago, and that's part of a bigger project that Catherine mentioned and Tim will get back to. What this data really shows, in summary, is a massive increase of Chinese outwards investments in the manufacturing of clean technologies. This both supports the host countries' development and supports a global green transition. So a few words on the database to begin with, and Xiaokang and Harold, he will elaborate on the methodology afterwards. So the database, it covers Chinese companies investing, not other countries. It counts only outwards, not Chinese domestic investments. It counts investments and not loans, which was the previous type of Belt and Road Initiative engagements. It focuses on manufacturing, not on actual power generation. And it focuses on the clean technologies rather than other types of manufacturing. So the scope is very clear and important to have in mind here. So the past data on this topic was, I don't know what the right word here is, was insufficient, to say the least, at covering this type of investment. And that's why we find that this data set is really so groundbreaking. Past research gave us all a hunch that China was doing these kind of investments, but it didn't give any clear indications of the actual scale and the ramifications of these investments. So that's why Harold and I, about a year ago, we began talking about creating this data set. At that time, we were both at Brown, and now we're elsewhere. So let's look at what this data shows. And I want to take you through 5 key takeaways that are covered in the next 2 slides. The first in this one. The first one is the scale of investments. It's more than 200 billion toward 250 billion, with a rapid increase basically since 2022. It's nearing 100 billion a year, which is around the same amount that China gave in infrastructure loans when that peaked in 2018. In comparison, the Marshall Plan by the US after the Second World War was around 200 billion in total also. That initiative really locked Europe into US technologies and standards. And as we see this is the same amount, it can potentially have the same effect in the future. Comparing these numbers with China's domestic investments in manufacturing, the annual investments were 340 billion in 2024, and this here we see 70 billion outwards. So it's about a fifth. It's the same in terms of stock, where there's about 1 trillion of investments in manufacturing these things domestically. Now the stock here is getting past 200 billion, also a fifth. The second point is the rapid increase, and let's look at that in the context of the first iteration of the Belt and Road Initiative. That was infrastructure loans, generally a high level, peaked in 2018 at around 100 billion per year. That totally fell off a cliff, a valley from 2020 to 2022, basically no Chinese investments or loans at all. And then we see this with the rapid increase since 2022. Numbers for 2025 suggest a stagnation, but we might end up near the level before. Getting near this amount, around 100 billion, is exactly the same amount of where the first iteration of the Belt and Road Initiative peaked. So this is very clearly the new BRI 2.0, we can call it. The third key takeaway is the status of the projects. Most of the projects we identify here are not actually operational yet. They're in the 3 previous phases that is shown here on the slide. That means that the actual production capacity will come online within a year or 2. That is the point at which we should see the actual impacts of the projects, both on the host countries' development and in terms of the dissemination of these technologies. The fourth point is around the technologies themselves. It's important to note that these investments cover most green technologies. So that means that this total dominance of green tech by China that we already know is globalizing. There's a little bit of less wind in the mix, but it's still part of the picture. Next slide, please, Catherine. The fifth point, we can draw it on a global map here. The point is that these type of investments have a global scope. It's across all continents, although there are certain countries that get a lot of these investments. What we see from this data is that there are basically three motives for the Chinese companies to do these investments. The first is host country market access. So countries realize that green tech is becoming a large share of their economies. Simply importing clean tech has negative consequences on industries and employment and so on. And therefore, they put in tariffs and local content requirements to make sure that some parts of the value chains are inside the countries. That's the Brazil case here. The second reason for these Chinese investments is access to third-party markets. As big markets like the US and the EU put up high tariffs on directly importing goods from China, Chinese clean tech companies then invest in manufacturing in places that have access to these markets. Morocco is a key example here because it has free trade agreements with the US and the EU. The third is access to raw material inputs. As this manufacturing scale grows, so does the need for the raw materials for it. Nickel, cobalt, lithium, for example. So mining is one part of that, but processing also increasingly takes place in host countries. Indonesia is an example, and in fact, a success story where a country bargains with China to capture a larger share of the value of the manufacturing supply chain. Those are the main statistical takeaways. Catherine, next slide, please. So there are basically four broad takeaways on how this data changes how we should understand China's role in a global green transition. It's around the green transition itself, the host country's development, finance, and trade. And just to say a few words on each in turn. Around the first, these investments can play a key role in advancing the dissemination of clean technologies, furthermore driving down the prices, and basically increasing the pace at which these clean technologies are deployed. Whether these manufacturing investments create overcapacity, that's essentially a question of whether there's profits to be made from the investments, not a concern about whether these technologies are needed, because obviously we need to scale up the pace of deployment to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. On host country development, these investments create a window of opportunity for host countries to conduct industrial policy. Some have done a good job at that, some have done a less good job. Tim will get back to this. Third is on China's role in finance for the global south. So the BRI first version lending went down. It was called small and beautiful, but it was basically more small than it was beautiful. What we show here is really the BRI 2.0. This is arguably a great thing, as many global south countries can't take on any more loans given their over-indebtedness. And over-indebtedness is, of course, not a problem when it's investments. There's any loans related to these investments on the balance sheets of the Chinese companies, not on the host country. The fourth is on global trade. So China has a $1 trillion current account surplus at this point. If manufacturing moves abroad, this could, to some degree, reduce this surplus. Right now, clean tech is only 5% of Chinese exports, but this is growing, and this might be a trend for limiting direct exports from China, and that could bring down some of these imbalances in the Chinese economy. Next slide, Catherine. So before we get into the methods, let me just say a few words on how we envisage the future role of this data. What we've shown here and what we've seen in these slides is the data itself and a preliminary analysis of it. The data will be made public as part of a global low-carbon technology FDI database. We will then issue policy briefs that analyzes this data from different angles. Some of the issues we will get into in these policy reports are the ones I've mentioned here. We will probably, as a first one, look at how Indonesia and Vietnam have responded to these kind of investments and the ramifications of these economies. And we hope that other researchers and policymakers and journalists will then find this database to be useful and pick it up and use it to inform the debate on this topic. Before, there was very little data on this topic, and the data set now provides a very clear overview that we think should inform how we look at China's new role in a global green transition. So these are the main findings, and I'll hand it over to Harold to explain the methods that we use to construct this data set.
All right, so thank you for Matthias' introduction of the major findings we have got for this report. And then I will just go over the basic methods we have used to put together this database. So I'm Harold, and in the next few slides, I will just go over the databases we use to consolidate the basics, and also the manual search methods we have used to find more projects for this database. So for this slide, the screenshot on the screen right now shows how the database looks like in the Excel. We do have lots of different columns, which is different variables, the sectors, the company names, the project names, also the start years, the annual capacity, if we can find it, and also the investment figure and the current status. So next slide, please, Catherine. Yeah, so for the existing databases, we basically consolidated 6 different existing databases, because as Matthias said, when we started to deal with the entire ecosystem, when we started to dive into this issue, we found out none of the existing databases were comprehensive enough to capture everything. So at first we had the AEI's Global China Investment Tracker, which should be the only publicly available comprehensive data set that covers China's outbound investment and the construction. It's really comprehensive. It captures all the sectors, but for the specific kind of low carbon tech FDI we are looking at, there are definitely gaps still existing. And notably for some smaller projects and the projects by newer companies, which is quite frequent for the low carbon technology manufacturing industry. And the second one is the BHI database. That one is a database developed by a Chinese consulting company, Huaxinjie, with ties to the NDRC and the few industry coalitions. So it's one of the largest Chinese databases capturing the entire trend, but it also only provides with limited access, and also sometimes data inconsistency with other databases. Yeah, and next slide, please. So the third one is actually a database included in a report by the Australian think tank Climate Energy Finance, published in 2024, whose name is Green Tsunami Report. So it includes a database on China's green FDI projects since 2023 to May 2024. So within this 1.5 years, and it includes both manufacturing and project financing. So we just selected those projects and that falls into the manufacturing category. And the fourth one is the BRI portal weekly newsletter. So that one that one is an official source tracking new overseas project by Chinese companies on a weekly basis since 2020. And it those newsletters are scriptable. So we just script all those news and then selected the manufacturing projects of our interest. Next slide, please. Yeah, and the rest two are more of supplementary sources. The first one is EVA Global. It's basically a Chinese NEV data provider and market intelligence agency. So it does provide supplementary resources for the EV industry, Chinese EV companies, factories overseas. And the last one is one smaller database developed by a China Africa Development Consulting Agency, whose name is Development Reimagined. And the name of the database is Tracking China Africa Climate Action Database. So it has one of the most comprehensive representation of Chinese engagement and Chinese manufacturing investment in Africa. So those 6 databases are the basis of our new more comprehensive database. Next slide, please. Yeah, but one issue arose is that after we consolidating everything and after we did cross check and reducing the duplications of those different databases, we still found that compared to the result we can find in both Chinese internet and Google, there are still many gaps. So to sort of solve this problem, we chose to use like a really extensive manual search method to add as much project as possible into the database. Because like manual searches, especially through Chinese channels like WeChat or Baidu, offers significantly broader coverage of investment projects. And also, like most companies, Chinese companies would like to update their project developments on their official WeChat accounts. And there are also a bunch of Chinese third-party consulting agency or like analyzing accounts, like covering like different industries like solar, like batteries, and providing some up-to-date analysis of the new updates of Chinese like low carbon tech companies overseas. So like to sort of address everything, we did use like a keyword, like a general search method, like pausing like specific searches to new down projects and to make sure every project really exists. So like for the keyword structure, we basically use like tag name, like the company name, plus like the geographical region, which can be like one continent, one specific region, or one specific country, and like and the Chinese thermal factory, manufacturing plant, and year. So for example, like I can just type in like Chinese green technology factories Thailand, or like Chinese solar investment Indonesia, and then like WeChat and Baidu will return like a list of different results. And I can use those results as a guidance to find if they are more credible or if there are more official documents demonstrating like those projects are existing. Next slide, please. And the good news is that like for newer projects, there are more and more specific WeChat accounts covering like updates of them. So for example, the one at the upper left, like it's like one think tank specifically focusing on China, Arabic countries, and China MENA country corporation. And the one like the one at the upright is one covering solar. And like the third one is like the official account of Goshen, like one battery giant in China, and the fourth one is one covering lithium batteries. So for newer projects, we do have like a few really credible sources that we can get like the most up-to-date project status of different projects and different companies. Next slide, please. And after getting everything, so we did have like a way to manage the data. So we use triangulation, like to cross-check like Chinese and English media, and to make sure we only return projects with official documentation or with reputable, or like has been covered by like credible or reputable media if that's an early stage project. And for status rules, we do have like a few different categories, like under consideration, planned, agreement signed, under construction, operational. And we would like update the project status like on new info, and only remove projects if they are confirmed cancellations by official sources or credible media. And also for the quality control, we would just resolve conflicts and like merge duplicates and exclude interest with like a hierarchy of different, like a hierarchy of credibility of different sources. And also like the last one, just talk about like the variables and values we are using. So the year refers to the time of the first announcement with the earliest verifiable reference. And we will also like just record investment capacity. And when amounts are undisclosed, we would just do estimate using benchmarks to similar projects in the same country. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, and because apparently we are using many manual searches, so there must be some limitations of that, and we would like to be totally transparent on that. So for example, there are definitely limited public available information for early projects, especially those before 2018 or 2019. And the expansion of existing manufacturing plants are really difficult to track because in most cases, Chinese companies will not actually disclose like each individual expansion or each individual like upgrade of their factories, and the project status sometimes are uncertain due to limited follow-ups and disclosures. Also, for many Chinese companies, like a postponements, like do not necessarily mean like the projects are canceled. It might just be like the projects are postponed, but like sometimes in the future it will be like revived. And the last limitation is like there could be like discrepancies between like initial disclosures, final outcomes. So yeah, but although like there are different limitations, we still try our best to do the triangulation, to cross-check, and to make sure the projects in the database really exist, and the quality of the data we have is like the best we can make sure. Yeah, so that's a part of the method, and I will hand it back to team. Thanks.
Cool. Great. All right, I'll take it up from here. Catherine, could we have the next slide, please? Okay, so as Matthias sort of mentioned, the future of the China Low Carbon Technology FDI database, that's what we're calling this. It's a mouthful, so we're just going to call it the China database. So the China database is going to be made public as part of the sort of a broader global FDI database that is going to be hosted by us, NZIPL at Johns Hopkins, and the GDP Center at Boston University. And we are currently harmonizing and combining these two data sets. And they'll be made publicly available in an academic publication early next year. As Matthias mentioned, in the meantime, we'll be issuing a series of policy briefs investigating some of our early findings from this database that you've already seen in the report. That'll be made available to everyone. So watch out for that. Next slide, please. I just wanted to sort of come back to sort of contextualizing the scale and the speed and the scope and the character of this green investment surge. So, and as we were just saying, this should really be called sort of a BRI 2.0. BRI 1, which happened in the decade prior, was roughly about the same scale. It was about $330 billion in sovereign lending. BRI 2, the one that we're talking about here, this green overseas manufacturing push, surges out post-2021, as you saw in our data. And that has a scale of about $250 billion in largely private sector investment. So those are the two absolutely different qualities, similar in scale, but different qualities of BRI 1 versus BRI 2. BRI 1 was state-owned enterprises largely going out. BRI 2 is private sector giants. Almost all of this investment is conducted, overseas investment is being conducted by Longi, BYD, Cattle, a bunch of solar, battery, EV, hydrogen electrolyzer firms that are going out. Again, a very different character. BRI 1 was largely state finance, debt, equity, loans. BRI 2 is largely private sector, working capital, largely equity carried out by firms' own working capital. BRI 1, as many of you would know, was largely heavy industry, logistics, connectivity investments, and often dirty and carbon-intensive investments, including power plants and exports of coal power plants, etc. BRI 2 is green industry, at least the data set that we're looking at here is green manufacturing overseas investments, again, mostly in battery metals, solar, EVs, hydrogen, etc. So this is qualitatively a different, greener BRI 2. BRI 1 was demanded by developing countries as a huge pull factor of filling infrastructure gaps in developing countries. BRI 2 is filling green industrial gaps in developing countries where many countries lack the know-how and are eager for investment in the new green industries. 75% of the investments that of these overseas investments are in emerging market and developing countries, which is not to say that they aren't in the US or Europe or elsewhere, but 75% of them are in developing countries. So if BRI 1 was filling infrastructure gaps, BRI 2 is filling green modernization, green development sort of gaps. Then the point that Matthias was making about the scale of the investments, where about 5 times as much investment has happened domestically inside China than has happened overseas. So BRI 1 was a spillover of a similar dramatically large domestic investment push inside China post the global financial crisis. And it was one of the largest domestic Keynesian investment pushes seen in world economic history in coal, steel, cement, real estate, really building out one of the largest sort of infrastructure pushes in history. BRI 2 is similarly an overseas spillover of something far more dramatic that has happened domestically inside China, which is a surge of the largest green manufacturing investment in the so-called new three industries of solar and EVs and batteries, and capital discipline on a dangerous, highly over-leveraged banking sector that had poured capital into the real estate sector. That was the three red lines policy. So you get a combination of a capital discipline on a carbon-intensive real estate sector and a big manufacturing surge in the new three sectors. So again, the point being that at BRI, one was external spillover of something far more dramatic that had happened inside China. BRI 2 is of a similar type. Then the main point that I really wanted to make here, which is that the outcomes of BRI 1, whether they were good or bad, whether they were positive developmentalists, whether they carried financial risk, environmental risk, or the sorts of choices of projects, depended significantly on host countries' own agency and policies. And you know, that's the assessments of experts, including our collaborators at the BU GDP Center. So that brings us to the big question mark here. What are the outcomes of BRI 2.0 going to look like for developing countries and other countries? Are they going to be developmentalist? Are they going to create jobs? Are they going to create local content? Are they going to be productivity enhancing? Are they going to lead to significant knowledge transfer and technology transfer? Are they going to lead to good environmental outcomes and not bad environmental outcomes? Is also going to depend significantly on host countries' industrial policies and countervailing pressure from political coalitions in host countries, and accountability campaigns by civil society. So if you sort of see our database as, 462 big manufacturing projects, over 60 of whom are mega projects, over $1 billion of CapEx, all of these are in some sense a set of investments that can be made far, far better if and only if developing countries exercise that kind of agency and these coalitions and accountability campaigns sort of are carried out. Next slide, please. And then the good news here is that we have been seeing a wave of green industrial policies in many countries to build out their own supply chains to ensure local participation of local firms and to build out their own knowledge bases with strategic investments in human capital. So as to not just turned into the more sort of extractive outcome, which would be cars, EVs, solar panels, batteries that are just assembled in country X, but are actually largely manufactured. Most of the value-added steps and value-added components is being done in China. So our recommendation from the report is, countries must continue to plan, must fund, and implement their own green industrial policies to achieve those developmentalist and not extractive outcomes. And as we said, the good news here is there's been a surge of domestic industrial policy in most developing countries, and that has been sort of the big pull factor, attracting Chinese firms to take advantage of new incentives being created by developing countries. On the left, you see this sort of surge of industrial policies, and there are many databases that track those. And on the right, you see sort of rising export restrictions. And again, this is not just a post-2020 phenomena. This has really been increasing over the last decade. The Indonesian nickel downstreaming policy was, started over a decade ago, and Indonesia is the largest recipient of this green manufacturing investment from Chinese firms in our database. And these resource restrictions are really important in sort of building that sort of domestic value added and domestic gains from countries' raw material resources. Okay, I think that's where we'll end here, and we're really looking forward to your questions for the next 20-25 minutes.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tim and Harold and Matthias. I will now open it up for questions. It looks like we already have a couple. Will we get the recording? Yes, we are recording the webinar and we will send it out to everyone after. Okay, second question. Let's see, from the map, it looks like a relatively low share of projects is happening in Africa. I found this a bit surprising given China's historical focus on Africa and China's courting of African governments. Interested to hear your reflections on this. Any takers from our panelists?
Yeah, I can say a few words on that. I mean, there's a clear difference to be drawn between Northern Africa and Sub-Saharan. We do see investments in North African countries, in particular Morocco, because that fits with the motive of accessing third-party countries. The reason we don't see so much investment in Sub-Saharan Africa is because none of these places really fit with any of these three reasons. Again, accessing the host country markets, third-party markets, or raw materials. The closest we get to that is cobalt in Congo. The problem here, and Harold, please elaborate on that, is that we don't include actual mining operations in this data set because cobalt is important for green technologies, but it's also used for many other things. So we simply can't separate the mining operation out of the rest of the supply chain that we insist on being clearly green. The same with nickel, the same with copper, the same with lithium. So that explains why we don't see so much in Sub-Saharan Africa. We do see an increased deployment of Chinese clean technologies, solar in particular. There was an EMBA report out a couple of weeks ago showing a 60% increase in the deployment of Chinese-made solar panels in Sub-Saharan Africa within the last couple of years. So we see dissemination of technologies, but though we don't see this type of investments that we calculate here. Harold, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, for sure. I can add a little bit. Yeah, so I really second like Matthias, like what Matthias just said, like on the cobalt situation in DRC. Because one big reason is that like actually for this database we did not include any cobalt operation like plans in DRC because firstly, the majority of them are like mining investments instead of like manufacturing investment. Like they're just like a really limited degree of manufacturing or chemical like synthesis, like part of or like the real manufacturing segment like within the critical mineral value chain. And also like another big reason is that like copper and cobalt are mostly like co-produced in DRC. And in many cases, the major rationale for companies or for Chinese companies to invest in those mines were like some preliminary processors of those minerals are not for like low carbon technology. So like regarding the rationale, like it's really hard to categorize all of them into the bin of the low carbon technology manufacturing investments. Yeah, and also, yes, actually starting from this year, we have seen like a few really small investments in Sub-Saharan Africa, but still like the skew is far from like the size of investment we are seeing in North Africa or Middle East, because as what Matthias said, like the market locally is too small to really attract like Chinese companies to set factories here. Like instead, they might just choose to export more solar panels or export more like low carbon goods into those places.
The only thing I'd add there is the Morocco the rationale for Morocco is that as we were just saying is that of an export base for manufacturing batteries for the EV for the European market. And even a single big mega project in Morocco, I am blanking on the name of the I think it's Cobalt's project, but it's basically gonna end up supplying something like 75% of batteries entirely for the European market, by the time it's fully up and running and operating at full capacity. And then the few countries that have received a green manufacturing investment in Sub-Saharan Africa are, the most industrialized countries. So South Africa has a battery plant and a solar manufacturing plant from Chinese companies co-investing with South African companies.
Thanks for those responses. Next question is about critical minerals. So the question is, what amount of the international green tech investment, if any, is going to critical mineral refining? It seems Beijing would want to keep that primarily domestic as it leverages its advantages in that area.
Well, a key question at the foundation of this is whether critical minerals are that critical, just like how rare are rare earths really. China certainly needs raw material input for these industries. Relating back to my answer before, we only count the mining and processing if we are sure that this is for clean technologies. And many of these critical minerals, so to speak, are not only for that. You do need these type of rare earths for magnets in electric vehicles, just like you need it in intercontinental ballistic missiles. But we don't exactly count the processing and refining of these things in this data set because it is for a broad range of technologies. Harold, are there any methodological considerations to add to that point?
Well, actually, for critical mineral, like I don't have much to add on. Actually, yeah, it's so like for critical mineral, it's mainly like Chinese companies have invested in countries where there are like sort of like export bans, like in Indonesia, like the situation we have all known, and like there are a few like sporadic investments in both Latin America and probably one in Zimbabwe, if I remember correctly. Yeah, but the majority of them still are like in South Asia and like in North Maluku and Sulawesi, where the nickel mines are.
Thanks so much.
Catherine, I see there's also questions in the webinar chat itself. There's
Yes.
on state support. That's very interesting.
Do you want to go ahead and take that one?
Yes. So the question is the role of this Chinese state in supporting this phenomenon, which is a very interesting question, especially in the context that the BRI 1.0 was entirely state-driven. This was organized by the Chinese government and the host country. It was then operationalized by financing from Chinese policy banks, from Chinese state-owned commercial banks, from Chinese state-owned insurance company Sinosure, and basically constructed by Chinese state-owned construction companies. It was all hands of the state on both sides. The loans would be sovereign-backed or tied to revenue sources from commodity sales and so on, all state. This phenomenon is all private. It's the private companies that raise the capital themselves to do investments, certainly encouraged by host countries because they want this type of FDI, but not subsidized in any way by the host countries nor by the China side, which is kind of surprising because of all the support there was for the first version of the BRI. In all the talks I've had with Chinese banks doing this type of lending in principle, they have not at any meaningful scale given loans to Chinese private companies to make these kind of investments. So we could in fact turn around and say it is in spite of the lack of support from the Chinese government and the Chinese government's financial institutions that they have been able to do that. So BYD did a partial listing in Hong Kong to finance their overseas investments. They didn't get the money from the China Development Bank, for example. So that's a very clear contrast in the role of the state in the first version of the BRI and what we are showing with this data.
Thanks, Matthias. I'll take another one from the chat box too. It's specifically for you, Harold, which is, do you have a sense of the scale of the gap in investment data in existing databases based on your search of WeChat, Weibo, etc.?
Yeah, for sure I can take that. So yeah, so I guess like by existing database, I guess like you refer to the Global China Investment Tracker by AEI, because that one is the most commonly used database like when we talk about Chinese overseas investment. So my feeling is like in terms of low carbon technology in overseas investment, like the one by AEI covers probably like less than half of the projects we have seen or we have captured like in our database. Because as I touched on like previously, like the major issues that like firstly they only cover like some huge transactions, which means like they won't be able to like seize or capture transactions with smaller investment amounts. And also like the majority of the most of companies of their interests are those like giants in the industry with previously like expansion like all over the world, like say BYD, say Goshen, say CTL. They have those big names in the database, and they will definitely track the most up-to-date updates of all those big companies. But the trend we have seen in the past 2 or 3 years is that more and more smaller players in different industries, say in auto parts, in EV parts, in batteries, and in solar modules, have entered the process of going overseas, have like started their own agenda of like building overseas factories. And most of those projects were not captured by the AEI's database. So yeah, that's my feeling. Like they have probably only captured like less than half of the investment. So probably like the majority of the major one, but it's definitely not the entire landscape. So that's my feeling.
And an additional gap of top of that, say there's the data covered by existing sources. We add way more projects to that. But what we show in this data set that's in the policy report is the projects that we have a relative confidence in. It's not our higher estimate. We have identified projects that we are not as confident in as the one included here. So a higher estimate of these numbers would add another something like 30 billion on top. So as we refine this database and do more triangulation of projects, it is likely that some of the numbers will be increased also from previous years.
Thanks. I'm seeing a number of questions related to the role of the host country in attracting this investment. So maybe, Tim in particular, maybe you could tackle that one. If you could speak a bit about the local content requirements in host countries, what extent they're guiding some of the investments from Chinese firms, and the various domestic policies that countries have to have in place to attract these investments. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, an example is really good here is that of Brazil with its Nova Industria Brazil policy, which is sort of Lula's Workers' Party project to do green industrialization in Brazil after having a fairly sort of primary sector focus export to China, where Brazil largely exported soybeans, iron ore, crude oil to China. And they are very keen on developing their own green industrialization to reverse 30 years of deindustrialization in Brazil. So Nova Industria Brazil is sort of like a large-scale project to develop all sorts of new industries, including batteries and cars. And again, it's the host country that decides what kind of technology that they want from China and they shape the cars. So in Brazil, they have an absolutely unique car market of sugarcane hybrid cars and that are sugarcane ethanol plus electric. And that's the kind of policy choice made by the Brazilian government for their cars. It's completely unique in the world. Everyone else does, other kinds of hybrid cars or pure play battery electric cars, but the Brazilians want a sugarcane ethanol electric hybrid car. So that's what the Chinese manufacturers did. Great Wall Motors, BYD, Chery have set up, large battery manufacturing, EV manufacturing plants in Brazil. So there's three of those big manufacturers have set up those plants. And those plants started out badly. There was a lot of reporting last year on the subcontractors for BYD abusing workers in very unsafe working conditions. And what was basically a feel-bad sort of story turned into a feel-good story after those accountability campaigns where the Brazilian regulators basically shut up BYD and said, you need to actually treat your workers well. And by early this year, BYD fired off its subcontractors, hired new subcontractors that supposedly are doing better on labor. And the state of Bahia that hosts this BYD plant, which is the largest and the first BYD plant in the Western Hemisphere near Salvador Bahia in Camaçari. They and we went there last year since we wrote a big report on Brazil last year. And the plant there, the state governor there demanded a 30 or 40% local content. And so that's in the MOU with BYD. And so now the question is, as the first car rolled out of that factory, just actually at the BRICS Summit in June this year, how much of that is actually going to be local content and national content? BYD says that they have started a process of vetting 100 Brazilian suppliers to be a part of their parts and component supply chain. Now, are they actually capable of manufacturing parts and components for BYD cars is a question mark. And it's one of these things that I said remains to be seen. Firms have to step up, countries' own domestic industrial policies have to step up. And I think BYD sort of stands, BYD in Brazil or Great Wall Motors in Brazil sort of stands as an emblematic case of how host countries have to do a lot more.
Thanks, Tim. Maybe building on that, I'm going to try to combine another two questions, which is how do recipient countries view Chinese investments, green investments, compared to Western alternatives? And what recommendations would you give for the EU, for example, in their response to China's financing overseas? Should it be competition? Should it be collaboration, or what?
Matthias, you should take this one.
Yeah, I can say a few words on that. I think it's important to understand at the outset that the Chinese companies are not doing these kind of investments because that's what they prefer. They would prefer to manufacture the whole thing inside China and export it. It's only because the host countries put requirements on Chinese imports that the companies are forced to do these kind of investments. And that gets to the point about how the host countries treat it. They recognize that direct imports of these technologies is a danger for their industrialization and development, employment, and so on. And they see it, on the contrary, as an opportunity, if they respond in the right way, to use these investments for their industrialization, to create employment, to develop the country. So the host countries that are good at it see it and use this as an opportunity, and others have less of a positive experience with it. But that is because they don't use this opportunity in a good enough way. So some of the things that will come out of our analysis from that is to figure out how should the host countries respond to maximize their own benefit from these investments. Who's doing the right things? Who's doing the wrong things? How should new countries potentially receiving these investments position themselves in global supply chains? What kind of requirements should they make for Chinese investors?
Yeah, and just on the sort of the European tech transfer point, I think Matthias is exactly right. Like, Chinese firms would prefer to do everything at home. The only reason any of this is sort of going out and internationalizing supply chains, is significant host country agency sort of basically saying you can't just sell us stuff, produced in China, sold to us on a ship and bought here. We want to learn how to make these things. So without that sort of counter pressure, there's almost no way in which these firms see it in their self-interest to do anything like this, anything like technology transfer. And the EU, has a large market and therefore was able to bargain technology transfer for market access, which is, a reversal of exactly what China did to many Western countries over the last 30 years. And that's going to require, again, significant European leverage, bargaining, their own industrial policy, training of workers, training of, battery chemistry PhDs, and setting up a large R&D and knowledge base capable of absorbing that know-how from advanced Chinese firms, because the boot is very much on the other foot. China is now the world's leader in almost all of these advanced green manufacturing know-hows, patents and skill and tacit knowledge, and that needs to be slowly transferred and diffused to the rest of the world. Otherwise, we're going to face, exactly the self-interest of firms to keep it all within themselves, locked in, maybe inside China.
And that, in fact, gets us to the question that was raised about if these investments are driven by environmental concerns, geopolitics, or economic interests. So these Chinese companies would probably maximize profits by exporting everything. So now they can't do that anymore. They still make profits by making these investments in manufacturing, even though it might be less. But what we know in capitalism is that if there's profits to be made, then profit-seeking companies will do that. So as long as the European Union, in this example, designs its policies in a way that there are profits to be made by the Chinese companies, then they will come. It would be an empty threat from the Chinese government to say, well, if you don't just open your markets, then you will never have clean technologies for your green transition. You can actually use your market as a lever, and you can make requirements, and the companies will still come because they can make a profit.
Thanks so much. I think that was a good point to wrap on. Just a big thanks to Matthias and Harold and Tim for spending an hour with us and teaching us a lot and answering all our questions. Before we go, just wanted to mention that the lab will be represented at a bunch of events this fall, including Climate Week in New York next week, the World Bank and IMF meetings in DC in October, the COP in Brazil in November, and several other bilateral engagements and multilateral fora throughout the couple months. So let us know if you're at any of these events. Feel free to reach out, sign up for our newsletter. We'll hopefully do more webinars like these in the future. And yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks panelists.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. See you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.